How do you learn how to ink? How do you decide the direction of the lines in a cross-hatching? Can you talk about your hatching technique? Yes, those of you who've been following me for a while know that in the past couple of years, my favorite technique has always been inking and cross-hatching. And many of you expressed their interest in wanting to know more about my technique. And today I'm going to try my best to cover this topic. For those of you who don't know me, hi, my name is Veronica, aka Vespertilio. I am an Italian comic book author, tarot and oracle deck creator, and your spooky art teacher.
It's me again, yours truly.
Before we start, I need to make a quick disclaimer. I attended art high school and graduated at the Academy of Fine Arts. But the truth is that most of my knowledge in terms of theory and practical skills comes from trial and error. So the most important thing to keep in mind is that you'll need to practice a lot in order to make a lot of mistakes in order to learn what works for you specifically. Start from this point, but you can and you should, in my opinion, find what works for you and maybe take something from this video and take something from another creator and take something from another artist and mesh everything together to find your personal technique. Let's quickly talk about tools. Many of you keep asking me what kind of liners I use. Some of you might have noticed that every once in a while my answer changes. That's because I really like to experiment, and I've been very lucky to have some brands gifting me their products basically. So I tried a bunch of different things. At the beginning of this sketchbook I would use the Ohuhu fine liner drawing pens, and they are absolutely great. That's the reason why I tend to not use them in my sketchbook, because I sketch a lot and so I always am afraid to waste art supplies. And so I switched to an amazing pen that unfortunately I think I lost during my weekend at the comic conventions. That's actually the pen that I used to use for those sketchbook pages, and I love that because it was so thin. And the main problem with this pen that made me try something else, since I draw a lot, it would run out of ink very quickly. I hated the fact that I couldn't refill the pen, and so every time I would have to buy the whole pen. And that's when I stumbled upon this beauty. It's called Preppy Platinum EF02. It is a fountain pen, and this has been my best friend for a while now. The first drawing I did entirely with this pen, April 26th, the first full drawing using this pen. Since then, I've been using that for all of my sketchbook pages, and I absolutely adore it. Last thing I want to say is that if you want to make very, very, very detailed pieces, maybe it's best for you to have a thinner point, like a 0.05 or a 0.1, 0.2 tops. But if you don't mind working with thicker lines, you can use a 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, even a 0.8, or you can use a regular pen, of course. You might not need anything expensive. Okay, so the other day, for example, I forgot my pen at home, and I only had this one that my friend Claudia gifted to me during the convention, and the ink is not even black, it's like dark gray, and I used this and it worked just fine. So you can really work with whatever you want, if I have to be honest. And with that said, let's get to the video. So the first thing we're going to do is an apple. This is an exercise that I am very affectionate to, because it was something that who went to high school with me knows very well. We had this professor De Vico. She would make us do dozens of apples for every lesson. She would make us do those apples hatching with pencil. And I actually discovered lately, while reading this real life of Leonora Carrington, that is something that she also did when she was studying art in London. With that said, what I'm doing now is I am using the second line art I did to show you an example of what you should imagine about your piece. So what I do is imagine the object, the subject, surrounded by a grid made of horizontal and vertical wires to make sort of like a skeleton. Here I am actually drawing it so that I could show you, but what I do is like I imagine this kind of cage skeleton made with wires, and then, as you're going to see in a minute, what I do is I keep in mind the direction of those wires and how they behave around the surface of the subject to make it three-dimensional, and I use the same grid to draw my hatching. So basically that's the trick. That's what you have to keep in mind, and that's something that you have to kind of practice in your mind to see this kind of grid, this kind of skeleton made with horizontal and vertical wires. And then once you have this in mind, you can pick your light source and start with your hatching. And here I'm just following the direction that's shown on the grid. So I'm proceeding first with the horizontal lines, and then I'm adding my cross hatching by following the vertical lines. And that is basically it. This is a very basic way to proceed, but actually very, very effective. And as you can see, not only results in a very pretty hatching, even though it's kind of rough and sketched in this case, but it also gives this three-dimensional look to your subject. So as a final touch, I am following the shape of the highlight on the apple, and this is something else you can do to decide the direction of the hatching. So you can combine different criteria when deciding the direction of the lines for your cross hatching. So now let's try to do the same thing with a more elaborate subject, tree branches. I'm trying to be as even as possible, but again, this is just a sketch, so that's fine if they don't look exactly the same. So let's start with this first bigger branch and build our grid. As you can see, the horizontal wires are already making it kind of look like it's coming towards us. Also, I'm so sorry for the camera going out of focus so often, but I totally forgot to set my focus, and so yeah, that's what we're going to deal with. Now let's see what happens if we change the direction of the horizontal wires curves in the back branches. What we are doing here is building the base for our three-dimensional rendering. In fact, as you can see, now the branches in the back look like they are going farther from us, while the first big branch we did looks like it's coming towards us. And that is going to help us in our hatching to give that feeling of depth and three-dimension. We're done with our imaginary grid, so let's move to the actual hatching practice. And again, like for the apple, by following the direction of the lines we established with our wires, we can create a pretty realistic rendering of our subject through hatching. Here I'm not going to use a cross hatching, but I'm still going to follow the shape of the subject to draw the veins on the branches. Keep in mind you're watching clips with a much faster speed than the real one, but this process is actually time-consuming and it's meant to be enjoyable and enjoyed. Take your time and take it like a sort of artistic meditation. I feel the need to talk briefly about texture, because that is something that can influence the criteria with which we can decide the direction of our hatching. So let's take a tube, for example. Let's proceed again by drawing the imaginary wires of our grid to establish the direction of our hatching. What you need to decide in this case is what kind of texture you want to achieve. By using only straight lines, fewer ones on the highlights and fuller on the darker parts, we're going to end up with a shinier look. So in this case, this could be a metal tube. While by using the curving lines, In this case, we're still going to achieve a three-dimensional look, of course, but it's going to look like a rougher surface, like a cardboard tube. So that's how important it is to establish what kind of texture you want to portray, and the only way to master different renderings for different textures is, of course, by practicing, by using references and by trial and error. Last but certainly not least, let's try with another more elaborate subject, a character. Let's try have the same process again on Vespertilio. Once more, let's draw the imaginary grid we need to get used to imagine to establish the direction of our hatching. As you can see, I'm not making a distinction between head and hair in this case. That's because the design of my character is rather simple. A more realistic and elaborated art style would require imagining the different parts of the grid for each element of the subject. I actually only realized later today that I totally forgot to add the crossing lines on the legs in this part. And while I think you got the idea at this point, I'm still sorry I forgot to draw them and didn't show you the complete grid on her. Finally, let's add our hatching on Vespertilio too. And once again, I'm following the imaginary wires to establish the direction of the grid. And I'm also changing the direction of the hatching according to the texture I want to show up. So for instance, I'm doing straighter lines on the wings and curvier lines on the rest of the body, while for the hair I'm simply following the direction of it and leaving white spots for the highlights. So this is kind of an improv cheat sheet about my hatching technique. Imagining this skeleton made with horizontal and vertical wires on my line art basically. And by imagining that, kind of determine the direction of the hatching. But as you're going to see in a minute, I work a lot by intuition. Sometimes I would choose the direction of the lines according to other criteria. For example, on the neck of the character, when I do the hatching for the shadow, I tend to follow the direction of the light, basically. I don't know if that makes sense, instead of following the wires, basically. With that said, I want to just talk about something that I'm afraid could be a little confusing, and that is actually the concept of the skeleton made with wires. I always put myself in your shoes, and I always tend to think, yeah, okay, that's great, but what if it was me, Veronica, of 10 years ago, and you would say the same exact thing? My first thought would be, okay, but how do you understand how the wires should be, how they bend according to the perspective, etc. And so I thought we could use this, a cardboard roll. I don't know how it's called in English. We're going to draw very quickly the grid on this cardboard roll and see how that behaves in 3 dimensions. Let's do it. So we're going to have a little heart attack moment and build a reference roll for us to use in our practice. What we're going to do is simply dividing the surface in equal parts and draw straight lines both horizontally and vertically, drawing around our object. Here I proceeded by eye, but you can measure the length of your roll and divide that number by as many parts you want, and then mark those on the roll and draw the lines around it. While for the vertical ones, I looked at it from the whole basically and imagined a cross dividing the circle in half, both vertically and horizontally, turned the tube by like 45 degrees and did the same thing again. And then did it again from the other side, and then I connected the marks with the vertical lines. That is basically what I did here, so you should be able to see what I mean. Once we have our reference roll ready, we can now move it around and study how those straight lines we marked behave from different perspectives. This way we start familiarizing with the imaginary grids. I used this trick before also on little ping pong balls, and that also helped me a lot with my practice. Let me show you again a little farther away. Let's say we have a perspective from above and we turn the object like this. The curves are going to go farther, okay? And that is basically the trick. If you want this to turn the other way, you'll notice again that this is the direction. Imagine we are having a perspective from below, so we see the object like this, and that's the same thing. The little curves always go towards the point that it's farther from us. So a nice trick is to have something like this, so whenever you're in doubt, if you have to draw 3 branches, for example, you can just move this around and see what this does. Practice is key. You should definitely not be afraid of using rather simple tools that could help you with your practice, especially with something new that you're never done, basically. With that said, we're now going to try put all of these into practice in an actual sketch of mine. The other day I was out for my usual walk by the sea. I stumbled upon a couple of crows that were hanging out on the rocks by the sea, and so I started drawing them and I added a little sketch of Vespertilio, but then I didn't finish the sketch basically, and so I think I could show you how I do my hatching on one of my sketches. Remember the little mouse pen I showed you in the art supplies bit of this video? I had to use it for part of the sketch, but since I didn't like the dark gray that much, I asked my sister who was with me to hand me one of her black pens, and now we're going to add our hatching and keep going with my Preppy Platinum fountain pen. So this to say that I used 3 different pens for this piece, 2 very cheap and 1 more expensive, and they all look fine and work together, so do not worry too much about the tools you use, for you'll probably be fine anyways. So here I pause for a second just to show you again how I'm following the imaginary grid around the ribcage of Vespertilio, and how by following the imaginary wires we studied before, I can build my hatching and achieve the 3-dimensional look I want. So my plan for this piece is to finish Vespertilio by adding hatching and also work again on the crows on the rocks, especially on the rocks, to build up a bit more contrast and separate the elements of this sketch. So the rocks, the water, the crows, and Vespertilio. Let me tell you again how important it is to enjoy the process, because inking and hatching are time-consuming, and by rushing the process, not only you might end up with an unsatisfying result, but you'll also most likely hurt your wrist. We have to imagine our arm like a reverse drawing compass. So one would imagine the graphite point is the pen or pencil in our hand, and that is what moves around, and the pin is our wrist, elbow or shoulder. But in reverse, the part that stays the same is actually our hand holding the pen, and we switch between the 3 different pins. What does this mean? If we need to do straight, long lines, we can use our elbow to have a wider ray and have more control, and by using our shoulder as pin, we'd end up with enough control for even straighter, longer lines, and you'd happen to work this way on large surfaces, for example. In hatching, we have to do a lot of smaller, closer, shorter lines, and so we have to use our wrist and use a smaller ray as our human drawing compass. That's why we need to take our time. Hatching as a physical activity is a wrist work, and if we rush with it, we most probably end up hurting one of our most important tools. And we don't want that to happen. So here's another very important reason to take your time and enjoy the process. There's no particular order to proceed though, or at least I don't have a particular method on what to do first and what to do last when stepping into the hatching part of the process. I might as well go back and forth between the various elements of the sketch and fix values here and there, and again take my time to make sure I did everything I wanted. Of course, that does not mean we have to become obsessed with it. We don't like perfection here. No sir, we embrace mistakes and are happy to learn new things with each new step. I simply do that much to feel good about my page, and that's when I call it a sketching session. That does not even mean you have to finish the piece. Sometimes an unfinished sketch looks good enough to me as it would a complete piece. And this is the final result. I really hope I was able to help you with this little lesson. I think there are a lot of other things to cover regarding hatching. I think something you actually asked me before and I never covered is how I work with values, where to make darker areas and where to make lighter areas. But I think that would require a proper video on that subject in particular. So I think we're going to cover that in another video. Let me know if you're interested or if you have any other questions or any other areas of this subject that you want me to explore with you. Basically, as always, if you have any suggestions or requests for future videos, please feel free to leave them in a comment below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope it was helpful. Again, you can simply help this channel grow by hitting the subscribe button and liking this video. My very first tarot deck, Vesper Tarot, is now available for purchase and you can get it at the link in the description. If you like my art and my content and would like to dig a little deeper, you can now join my newsletter. Also, check my partnerships in the description of this video because you might find interesting exclusive discount codes for different websites. If you stay till this point, thank you very much. I will see you very soon with more art videos. In the meantime, let's make art. Bye.